As Howell kindly introduced me, I came from Cambridge where it's completely flat, and so I've had a robust walk up the hill here to the Exeter campus. The first thing I want to point out is that this is not Boris Johnson on my slides, this is David Attenborough, and he is the patron of the place where I mostly spend my time these days, which is the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which is a collection of NGOs such as BirdLife, the UNET WCMC, the RSPB and so on, along with the University of Cambridge, and we all kind of work together with lots and lots of collaborators trying to figure out some of the answers to today's pressing problems in conservation. So I'm a computer scientist, and normally when we begin with these things, computer scientists take a very operational view of these things. So but my first few years working in the field of conservation was going, well, you clearly all have a computer-shaped problem, so what can we do to try to fix that problem? And so it was clear that the amount of data is increasing close to exponentially over the course of the last few decades. So Earth observation obviously is bringing in petabytes of data annually. And then also ground sensing and lots of other sources were generally turning conservation into what looked like a data problem. And so we first postulated this thesis that we really need to have the global infrastructure, much like the internet is, to help us with the pipeline of data science required to figure out how to empower environmental science. And then somehow magically, this would empower environmental decision making. But then reality kind of hit home, which is that, is anything we're doing really having an impact? And there's this real existential crisis that builds up regularly, I think, when working in climate change, where you just go, well, if I make any one individual action or any one change, will it really make a difference? And I was just talking to Oliver and James, two of your master's students here about that, about how it's really important to kind of figure out what is success look like when you're looking into conservation. So I started really deeply into this, trying to figure out, well, what is conservation trying to kill all humans and protect the planet? Is there some notion of justice? What is success look like? And I found this brilliant paper that I recommend everyone has a read from three of the senior scientists at the WCS, where they called it the bottleneck to breakthrough. And what they described was that, yes, today is looking like a very dire situation. So we have got emissions that have not quite peaked yet. We think China might have peaked this year, but probably not quite yet. Global inequity is rising. You only have to watch the news to realize just how much climate adaptation is having an incredible effect on world geopolitics. Tropical forests are generally being chopped down, and land use conversion is also still progressing as well. So things look bleak right now. But what we're really trying to do is to look forward to a future where there's a breakthrough. And there's encouraging signs throughout the last century or so, really the post-World War II period, that we are in fact steadily kind of turning the ship in the long term. So we are seeing increasing plans for net zero, increasing adoption of renewables. There are hopeful signs that extreme poverty is being eradicated. Infant mortality, for example, has dropped steadily to the lowest levels in human history in recent decades. Old growth forests are, while they are being cut down, they are being stabilized, and most importantly of all, world population is also stabilizing at a projected 10 to 14 billion over the course of the next 50 years or so. And once human population stabilizes, then we end up in a situation where we can then work backwards and say, well, what is the amount of land use we need? What is the amount of optimal balance between human and nature? And so there is a future where we have broken through our existing extractive economy and we've learned how to live in harmony with the planet. So then our job, and in particular, I think the role of computer scientists, is to help figure out what is a data-driven approach where we can stack rank actions based on real evidence that we see today in order to help figure out what we should protect such that it will survive into the breakthrough. We don't want to protect these forests forever. We're like a relay race in the Olympics where we're trying to hand off the baton to the next generation and to the next generation who will then preserve those vital kind of fragments of old growth nature, of species diversity, and then try to keep it going until humanity as a whole has optimized itself. So if you are going through an existential crisis, as I go through every few months working in this stuff, then this paper I found was one of the most readable and to me exciting and motivational pieces of writing in this space I've read in many, many years. And so based on that, we started thinking about, well, what is a mechanism by which we can come up with some of these evidentiary signs of global decision making. And one of the key areas that I focus on is biodiversity. So while emissions and CO2e related topics are obviously of huge importance, what's even more concerning to me is the precipitous decline of species worldwide across almost all taxa. So we're seeing that insect populations are collapsing right now. There's been a decline in up to 70% of some of the world's most commonly counted species in the last 60 years. And so generally speaking, wildlife is in retreat and is retreating ever faster. And this hugely comes from agriculture and generally of anthropogenic changes. And so we're trying to figure out if someone is making a land use decision change, that is, we are bulldozing a forest or we are restoring a patch of land anywhere in the world, what is a comparable way of figuring out what we should convert and what we shouldn't with respect to our relationship with nature? And so this life metric was an enormous exercise in remote sensing where we wanted to measure biodiversity with respect to species diversity specifically. And really, we're trying to figure out how do we create a metric that for the range of species diversity across a certain range of tens of thousands of species, we can compare the relative impacts of changing one bit of land and another bit of land, and just understanding what the shifts in probability of extinctions are for these different species as well. And the idea is to make this a highly transparent and open source data set with all methods and all inputs as public as possible to facilitate refinement and peer review over the course of time. So let me give you a quick intuition about what this life metric looks like. This is the bush hyrax. It is the closest living relative to the elephant. It's about this big. And it lives in East Africa in a certain range. And so what we do in life is that we take in a bunch of expert range data, so there's no Earth observations just yet. The expert range data is calculated by the IUCN and a whole bunch of other experts who per species, on the red list of endangered species, figure out what its likely ranges are. And they take as inputs some remote sensing, but also often habitat preferences and a whole bunch of other data as well. And then we start introducing remote sensing by combining those very coarse polygonal range maps with specific fine-grained data based on elevation, habitat maps, again calculated through remote sensing. And we can come up with these areas of habitat which are quite fine-grained binary markers that a species could live with no probability, just a binary thing, in this particular area. And then we've done this for one species, and it's a reasonable amount of computation. But then we start bringing in computer science by making this a huge data problem by taking in tens of thousands of species, taking all of the rasters and knowledge about them that we can find, and then crunching them all together into what will eventually be a unified global map for birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, and then eventually add on things like plants and other marine animals as well. And so the idea behind life is that if we can take all of this data, and there's an enormous amount of data there, we can comparably measure the probability of persistence of every single species on any given piece of land. So to quickly walk through it without going into a huge amount of detail, the idea is that once we've calculated the suitable habitat for a given species, we can then know that intuitively that there is a curve that measures whether or not a species will go extinct at a certain probability depending on how much of its habitat has been removed. So if you have an enormous forest range and you remove a tiny patch of forest, then it's going to have some effect on the probability of extinction, but probably not a huge one. But then as you accelerate the percentage of AOH that disappears, then this persistence curve will reflect the fact that your chance of extinction is increasing. If you're an endemic species with a tiny range, then you will have an enormous shift in probability of extinction if even a small part of your land is modified. And so all we do is we just calculate where we are if you flip a single pixel in the world or restore it, and then we plot onto that curve and we add them all up. And you end up, oh I keep banging this thing, and we end up with nice kind of global maps that measure two things. They measure what is the damage, the increase in the probability of extinctions for a set of species if you were to convert this land away, and then what is the benefit, how much do we improve the chances of survival for a set of species if we were to restore some land as well. And so both of these give us the dual facets of human expansion and also of restoration activities as well. But it's important to realize that they're not completely symmetric. If I were to convert some land and then restore it, I will improve the chances of some species living, but it will not go back to what it was. That can take decades or centuries or more for the biodiversity restoration for that given set of species to actually activate and take part. So, where computer science comes into this is that this is an enormous amount of data. So we take in a total of 70 petabytes of data for each of these runs, and then it involves lots and lots of species and lots of recalculation whenever experts come up with new information about exactly what is happening in these particular areas. So we want to generally be as precise as we can, but we also want to make sure that we are as unbiased as possible. And one of the big problems in any kind of observational approach to biodiversity is that there's huge biases in where data is actually collected, and so therefore, even with the best efforts of the IUCN experts who are trying to debias this data set and move it away from roads and other kind of easily accessed areas, there's still a lot of that in there as well. But it's important to note at this point that this is all just statistics. We haven't yet used any artificial intelligence. We're simply using good, well-structured, well-understood Earth observation products and expert data in order to craft this particular bit of information as well. And it's eye-opening to see just how much data goes into one of these things from lots of diverse sources. And each of these sources is constructed from the results of lots and lots of human endeavor. So to calculate, for example, forest carbon maps, we need to figure out what the forest carbon information is. We need to have forest models. We need to then take species persistence maps. We need lots and lots of input sources. And the real data flow graphs that go behind these calculations are large and complex. But they're now under control because even 70 petabytes still runs on one machine, just one very large machine that we bought for around £30,000. Something that would have been computationally infeasible in the past is now entirely feasible to kind of pull together without having to have lots of fancy cloud computing resources. You can just, on campus, literally underneath one of our desks, run one of these compute models over, and it can spit the results out in a matter of hours as well. And so, what the purpose of this kind of life map was, and we just published this in January, so it's still picking up steam, was to figure out, well, how do we continue through to affect policy making? And I just wanted to quickly show you one sort of exciting result that's come out based on combining these maps on global biodiversity with food provenance maps. That is, where is food produced in the world and where is it consumed? And whenever you do this work, we took the FAO's 150 kind of foodstuffs, and all we did was figure out, well, which country's source did the food come from? What is the likely region within that country where it might have come from? And if you add up the life scores, then we know that the amount of agricultural impact in that country, so we can estimate spatially what the biodiversity impact was by human agriculture converting a bit of land. And you can see immediately on this log graph, so the life score itself has no real meaning except for being comparable to other life scores. It's a strange unit, which is the shift in probabilities of a series of species. But what is really obvious is how ruminant meat is way up there on a log scale versus the more conventional kind of vegetables and so on. And then you can also see that as you get towards things like vegetable products and dairy products, that some dairy products have a much higher impact versus other ones. And other things like grain and rice are spatially much more substitutable as well. So we're starting to see now how human actions can be tied to some of the things going on. It gets politically very charged when you then break down the same graphs by country. So in this one, we're just saying, well, who's importing and exporting what kind of foodstuffs? Well, in this case, Brazil is doing an enormous amount of damage to the tropical forests. However, 80% of all ruminant meat in Brazil is consumed domestically. So it's their choice and it's their right to do that. It gets worse when you look at the UK, where a vast amount of our ruminant meat production is actually imported from elsewhere, and so we're outsourcing our biodiversity damage by spatially obtaining that from areas that have been turned into pasture farms as a result of converting tropical forests, which in turn are a huge source of species diversity. So you can start to see how we can now start connecting the dots and tying our actions to actual impacts based on choices that we not only make as individuals, but also systemically make in terms of our supply chains and our sourcing as well. So this, for example, has resulted in Cambridge a big push to make ruminant meat not available by default and try to shove it down the menu list so that we can just reduce our consumption because people tend to pick the food that is at the top of the menu. So this is what life is. It's an AI-free mechanism for taking human knowledge and Earth observations of the traditional kind and trying to put them together into some kind of actionable metric that we can use as a globally comparable mechanism. But the huge problem with all of this stuff is that the resolution of this is roughly at 1.8 kilometers squared, so 1 arc degree, 1 arc minute. And we have a certain amount of data gathered from experts, but this data tends to be of the sort you might expect from human approximation. So for example, if you look into some of these things, you'll notice suspicious circular-looking AOHs, where someone's just said this particular orchid lives in a 4 kilometer squared radius, and so the official area of habitat is marked as being that. You can also see other ones which are kind of strangely coincident on political borders, strangely coincident on other kind of features, and you suddenly realize that actually there's been a lot of approximation that goes into these these kind of expert maps, right? There's limits to what we can do across tens of thousands of species, no matter how many volunteers and decades we kind of throw the ball. And so the huge pressure that we're under is, can we use AI to upscale this and just generate magical 10 meter squared maps? Who thinks we can? No one. Oh, I got a few of you. Go to Optimus. Yay! We can, eventually, right? But it is so much harder, surprisingly, than generating those initial set of maps, which are the global kind of observation maps. It is a very different process to go into a high-resolution, hyper-local metric that is trying to decide what is happening at a 10 meter square resolution than it is to take an Earth observation perspective on something that is operating at a kilometer scale. And it's very dangerous to just kind of go into it without realizing this. So our challenge right now is trying to figure out how we connect the dots. And the reason this is so difficult is just how much data there is in biodiversity. So when you think about just even the simplest place in any kind of natural environment, then if you were doing something like measuring atmospheric CO2, then you kind of have one thing you're trying to measure, right? You're trying to measure methane and CO2, for example, in the atmosphere. With biodiversity, you're trying to come up with evidence bases that are trying to form causal patterns for isolated events, such as a particular species interaction, and then you're trying to shove it all together with tens of thousands of species and trying to figure out what is happening in this wetland or this tropical forest where there might be 50,000 species in a very, very kind of small area. And so what happens, this example is looking at insect biodiversity from a recent paper in Science by one of my colleagues, and it looks into many, many different types of evidences. So you've got the usual kind of spatial measurements, and then you've got experts coming in saying, this is how we think these species interact. And then you've got experiments, you've got randomized controlled trials and field work going in and trying to get all these details. And then you need computation models to try to figure out what is happening ecologically in response to certain drivers. And then you've got to combine all these things and take a time series view on all of this, because climate change is accelerating and is increasing in intensity and resonances. And then the most important thing of all is that you've got to validate all of these results at the end of the day and try to figure out if we are, in fact, heading in the right direction. And to complicate everything, because the future is not directly predictable from past events, because of new threats and new drivers and new kind of climate resonances, we have to somehow project all of this across space and time, and then, at the end of that, describe actual conservation actions, the things that we do to try to preserve nature in the short term. So there is an enormous gap between taking a global or a subnational or a regional view down to what do we do in our local kind of nature reserves as well. And all of this biodiversity data is scattered across space and time. So there's an excellent summary in the Science paper about the different kind of temporal coverages required, the different spatial and kind of environmental coverages, and also the diversity of viewpoints that we need to incorporate in order to make all of this kind of work as well. So it's a real challenge trying to take a biodiversity view when you're starting from space. So what we're having a go at, and this is all kind of work in progress at the moment, so I'm going to show you, so I thought you might appreciate just seeing some of the more cutting edge kind of work that we're doing, and by cutting edge I mean extremely likely to fail, because on the basis that we have to take a few risks in order to figure out how to tackle a problem of this enormity because of the urgency involved in that as well. So take everything I say here as stuff that is, we have preprints and so on about it, but also it's very likely that one of you will have an idea that will make us change course dramatically as well. So part of why I'm here is to get that kind of feedback from you as well and try to understand what you think about it. The first one is that we break apart what we know about biodiversity into two sort of broad things. One of them is, what do we observe, right? So what is the observational characteristics of something that will result in some correlative behavior? So, and Earth observations are a classic example of this, where you can use satellite data, you can use ground sensing data as well to try to kind of form views about some occupancy characteristic or some observed behavior. And then, completely on the other side of things is the scholarly literature. So this is things that we know. And these are really trying to form causal relationships and trying to establish causality through a sequence of observations and experimental trials, and doing so in a way that convinces us, the scientific body, that something is in fact a real phenomenon that does have a genuine causal link. And then, of course, beyond the conventional scholarly literature, there is an enormous and untapped amount of indigenous knowledge, the so-called grey literature, which is not necessarily recorded in any kind of official form, but represents a huge amount of knowledge about what is actually happening on the ground on indigenous lands, which often are where a huge amount of natural species diversity also is as well. So we have to somehow figure out how to kind of put all of these things together as well. So the first thing we're trying to do with satellite data is trying to figure out, is there a lightweight way that we can put some of these pieces together? And one of the first problems that we came across when working on satellites is how many of the darn things there are. So you've got everything from the multispectral satellites like Landsat and Sentinel-2, then you've got synthetic aperture radar, then you've got JEDI, the giant space laser, just wandering around on an east-west orbit, trying to figure out how high things are. We've just had biomass launch, which is a new P-band radar that can penetrate canopies. There's a lot going on there. And the number of instruments and the diversity of instruments is only going to increase as time goes on. So we're looking for this kind of holy grail, which is there a compressed form of data by which we can store and manipulate and analyze some of these Earth observations in a slightly more dynamic way? And the whole field of geospatial foundation models has been, I think, one of the most exciting in computer science in recent years, because it's moving at a pace where LLMs were moving just a few years ago. And we've seen, we're going to hear about IBM's foundation model tomorrow. I'm really excited to hear more about what's happening with Prithvi. There's been a sequence of fast releases. So what we're doing with our foundation model is really just working under two constraints. One is, we've got almost no GPUs, right? Our computers are down all the time. And so we've got about 4 GPUs, where we thought, what can we do by just using and looking at the data a little bit more carefully and trying to apply just more mathematical chops rather than trying to beg for GPUs that we don't have. And then secondly was this insight that most of the time we care about seasonality in foundation models. So over the course of a year, when you observe what is happening in a particular patch of land, that there is an annualized season where the spectral temporal properties do vary in quite an observationally different way. And the second one is that clouds get in the way all the time. And so conventionally we remove clouds when learning, because there's a big giant cloud over the land you're trying to see, and so therefore the natural thing to do is to strip it out and get on with training the model on the actual land. So we tried something a little bit different, because in many cases the cloud cover is only partial, and there's still a lot to learn from there. And crucially, if you take the year's observations on a given pixel, and you arrange it in such a way that you've got a nice kind of day-by-day set of pictures into one single picture, we can build something that we dubbed a D-pixel, which consists of 13 bands of very specific satellite data, and then all of the observations on that particular region as a sequence of images. And then we train using a mechanism known as Barlow siblings, which is a variant of another classic image technique called Barlow twins, in order to figure out, can we compress into a small kind of 128 vector representation what this given pixel is from a spectral temporal perspective. We don't do patch-based kind of analysis where we look around at things around the pixel. We're looking at this one pixel and just going, can you encode what you are purely from Sentinel 1 and 2 in that one pixel? And the results are incredibly encouraging. And so one way to debug these foundation models, we're not using them for anything real just yet, but you look at a false color version of the representations, and that tells you, if you can see an eyeball, the fact that different things look different, and that similar-ish things are roughly mapping in a lower dimensional sense to the same colors, then there is something more to be done with these models. And so, although it's a little bit washed out from the glorious sun here today, you can see how in different areas, for example, in cropland in Austria to California, kind of wildfires in the past, to mountainous regions, there is a distinct structure emerging from the representation, and there's no tiling artifacts and so on. It's basically the model has learned what it's trying to build out from that as well. So what this is all going towards is that we now have a compressed model using a fairly lightweight bunch of machine resources that is useful for subsequent training in order to use in downstream tasks. And so these foundation models themselves are no use by themselves. They're simply compressed representations and bundles of higher dimensional vectors. You don't use them for anything. But then, when aligned and tuned with validation pipelines and downstream tasks, they could become a very, very powerful force for learning more about augmenting our existing remote learning pipelines. So here's just some of the examples of projects we're doing with them. Obviously, won't go into them for the interest of time, but the diversity of downstream tasks involving observations is absolutely incredible. So we've done everything from crop classifications and all the way to even looking for correlative effects for underground fungal biodiversity networks as well. So just by the simple insight that the underground fungal biomasses are probably where there are plants of a similar nature above them, and therefore can you then use this to predict using validation data sets from people that work in fungal biodiversity, what the situation there is as well. And so where this is going is that we're going to be releasing one of these open models. It's already kind of up on GitHub at the moment, but it's still kind of waiting for the representations and stuff to download. But if any of you are doing things involving trying to look at pixel-based interpretations of some of these things, then this is another contender in the space in order to look at as well. And bear in mind, of course, always the warning that this has to be done with a validation pipeline and with conventional Earth observation techniques in mind, and not just taking the results of one of these models and assuming it to be ground truth. That is a recipe for disaster. So once we did that, then there's also a lot of ways you can start to combine these foundation models. And that's the other reason why I'm really excited by the diversity of different approaches to training that we have. So this is one simple one where we've taken Landsat in order to do optical segmentation of tropical forests, and then we use hyperspectral imagery in order to then do species-level identification based on a very rich set of data that comes back from hyperspectral probes coming behind it as well. So we've identified now dozens of new species of trees that come from that as well. So the combination of each of these things is proving to be really quite powerful. But then, okay, that's what we see. But we're going to hit limits for what we can see, right? So can we do something a little bit out there in order to figure out what we know, and then can we combine these things together? So the other thing we had to go at was to say, well, if there is a bunch of stuff that we know, and we have huge data gaps in our observational collections of biodiversity, then surely we can use the literature to come up with synthetic data by understanding a giant model of all of the endeavors of academia and museum collections and herbariums and so on over the course of the years. And so we went to the Cambridge Library, and I highly recommend you all do this if you're in any way interested in LLMs, is go to your local librarian and have a chat, because they're super lovely. We said we would like to get some papers around conservation, and they went, sure, which ones? And well, we said we'd like all of them, and we should be able to get all of them. Cambridge is a copyright library, so for 800 years or so, it's been getting a copy of every book ever published. In the last 40 years, that changed. We went from being a library where physical books were deposited to one where we're renting the ability to eventually access a book by going to a publisher and requesting access and paying them lots of money. So we said, well, we do pay millions a year to get these papers, so we created a giant crawler. We negotiated bulk download deals with the publishers, and under risk of extreme bad things, these papers download can never leave Cambridge because they're legally only for use here. But then it gave us the opportunity to figure out, well, what can we do when you have a ton of papers? And it turns out that LLMs are advancing at a speed where you can do really fine-grained analysis, not by using one single LLM, but by using a sequence of small specialized SLMs that go through a long pipeline of looking for individual things. So for example, one might be an abstract summarizer. One might look at a paper and ask, is it in fact a trial? If it is a trial, another SLM tries to figure out which spatial region it's looking at. And we ran millions and millions of these things through a pipeline in order to look at how well we can do in order to augment evidence synthesis, which is the process by which we do systematic reviews of these sort of things. And so when we did this, it turned out to be quite a bit of fun because what you can do is, oh, there we go, is you can take the body of literature, and so this is, all of the green ones have been looked at by people doing evidence synthesis and conservation evidence. The gray ones are ones that aren't, and these are automatically kind of categorized and tagged based on an abstract and a full text summarization into a series of areas which are then kind of mapped onto various kind of systematic reviews from there as well. And you can see how well the fully automated one did. It gets really exciting, and this is something we're working on at the moment when it's unfortunately a little bit washed out there, but you can see how millions of papers ranked into kind of three-dimensional embeddings actually look almost like a living thing because you're trying to spot all the higher dimensional unexpected connections across things. And this is where LLMs are proving incredibly effective because normally when people do literature searches, they do keyword searches. But what we're finding in these papers is that often the direct keyword is not a good indicator for exactly what is happening elsewhere in the literature. For example, if some second-order effect caused vultures and Inti to die, it turned out to be because of antibiotics given to cows, then a keyword search would not elicit that in an immediate systematic review. But these kind of knowledge graphs do have the ability to kind of figure that out. So we think it's a really exciting area trying to kind of put some of these pieces together in order to figure out exactly where the causal knowledge is in the literature. And so I can give demos to anyone who wants to see about the full system where we have a labeling pipeline, we have the ability to look over the papers, search for them, and also extract out inclusion criteria for anyone who's doing a search for some scientific review of some kind. And of course, because this has all been downloaded and is hosted, it's reproducible and it's open, and it's not giving the data to any kind of proprietary frontier models as well. So this is generally how we're thinking about the space at the moment then. We're taking observational data from satellites, and ground data from field plots and so on. We're taking human mobility data to know where likely expansion points are, and then, of course, citizen science like iNaturalist, and then trying to kind of put it all together. And then with observations, we're combining that with literature from all of these different diverse sources with hundreds of millions of papers in order to figure out what the future of multimodal foundation models are. So that is not just foundation models that have been trained on images, on sound for bioacoustic data, but also on causal information. So that if there is a doubt about something, for example, you can't see beavers from space, but you can see the fact that there is some suspicious flooding happening in fields in an area where beavers have been released. So it's very likely that if you spot this during a particular kind of dry season, as happened in the UK when beavers were released a few years ago, that the causal link there that is not observable from space is in fact something that we know from our set of knowledge. But it's all, there's a lot of kind of red signs showing up at the moment though. And some things that I just wanted to talk about to close, about things that we really have to worry about and keep an eye on as we're advancing and integrating AI into this whole practice. The first one is that there's lots and lots of new data sets being put out which are machine learning derived in some description, but not labeled as such. And so if you feed into a new training run the outputs of an old training run from another model, it does accelerate model collapse in most cases because the model is not learning anything new. It's simply being fed its own output again and again. And so we are at a point now where we've managed to poison our own literature. There's lots of use of LLMs in scientific papers, so we only use papers from 2023 and backwards. And the same is increasingly true for maps as well. So if you spot a high-res map that looks suspiciously high-res and hasn't been done by your friends at the Ordnance Survey who've done so with decades of experience, then it's probably a good idea to be suspicious and to make sure that you've got a good sense of where the provenance of this came from when you're putting it together. And the same is true, as I mentioned, in papers, where an increasing number of papers in literature are not necessarily fully AI generated, but they certainly have lots and lots of AI generated content in there because of the luring autocomplete of most editors now when you start writing some text. But the very first complete AI generated paper, end to end, was just accepted into an ICML workshop a few months ago. And this was from hypothesis generation to designing the experiments to running it and passing human peer review, and it's happened. So obviously ICML was aware of this, and it was done as a bit of a stunt, but it's clear that the next few years will be a dramatic phase change in the way that we approach how we're doing these things. So we've got to train these models right now, keeping an eye on what we knew was human generated, because our ability to have provenance is bad. And ultimately, all of that just ends up reinforcing data biases from the global north that will disaffect billions of people living in the global south, where a lot of the data has not been gathered. So we're in real danger of turning this into a bit of a colonial conservation conversation unless we can kind of step back and fix some of these things. And so what we really need to do and think about is, don't just blindly integrate AI into Earth observations. And I think I'm in extreme agreement with I suspect the keynote on Friday, because we have to really step back and understand how to apply these things. The first thing is we need to understand the provenance and reproducibility of our infrastructures. So this means that we need an open source and an open data style approach in order to make sure that we don't just trust any one organization, no matter who they are, with all of our data. And the second thing we have to do is that we need benchmarks where we can compete. All of these models need to compete on an open playground where you know for a given task if they're good or bad. The current situation, unfortunately, is that while there is a certain amount of field data for biodiversity, it's very scarce. And so the situation is a little bit like a maths exam, where we've designed a set of maths questions, and we run the exam, and then we repeat the questions year on year. We might select from a small set of questions, but we're still reusing the same basic questions all the time. Eventually, students will figure this out, and the value of the exam will drop. And with biodiversity, because the same kind of biodiversity field plots are being shared around a lot of these models, we're hungry for more secret data. And so we've been encouraging people and field biologists to go out there to get out of the ground truth and not tell anyone what the answers are. Because if you tell them what the answers are, then you revealed this, and the memory effect will make sure these models will learn and understand them. And so the Nobel Prize was won this year by a computer scientist for the first time, one of my former colleagues, Demis Hassabis, and he said that the way that AlphaFold really worked was that the biologists have been running a competition for 20 years where experimental biologists who discover a protein do not reveal it. They hold it for a year, and then the computational biologists predict the things that the experimental ones learned. Can you imagine convincing a bunch of people to not reveal and publish their data? But this is what they did, and that then allowed AlphaFold to build up the head of steam it needed to develop its machine learning methods as well. So I'm confident that Earth observation foundation models will get to the point of transforming this field, but we need to be really disciplined the way the protein folding predictors were in order to make that work as well. And so to give you a sense of how bad the problem is, I'll just quickly show you this. And this is looking at Earth observations from JRC. And what this is doing is it is figuring out, and so we want to figure out what is the deforestation rates in Indonesia for 2020. We downloaded the JRC 2022 dataset for 2020, right? And then we said, well, why don't we just re-download it again? And we downloaded the 2023 one. And this is what you see. And so this is because the data sets themselves for the same year have recomputed their algorithms, and an area the size of Wales has suddenly become reforested in Indonesia. So if you're feeding this as the input into a foundation model, the version of the data that you download makes a massive difference to the accuracy and the validation of the resulting foundation model. because behind the scenes, the primary data has already gone through a lot of conversion and processing, and unless we keep track of all of this stuff, we're just training our models on incorrect data. So, and this is a highly credible, standardized data set used for forest cover and land use and disturbance and so on. Now, they're obviously highly motivated to make sure they have the best possible algorithms that they use, so they regularly recompute for past years, but it's another thing to keep in mind as well. And so therefore, to conclude, what we really have to figure out from a computer science perspective is how do we have a permanence in the way that we program these things? How do we keep track of data formats, petabytes of data, stop capture by any one organization, and also make sure that we maintain a path for academia to continue to build on these open models and to make sure that we can continue to innovate. If anyone is interested, there is a collection of people working on something called Programming for the Planet, co-organizing in October, and it's open for talks, opinions, provocations, and papers to follow on from any of the conversations you have here today as well. But in the meanwhile, I'd be delighted to take any questions throughout the rest of the day, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Fantastic provocation for the conference. A great start to the day, I think we'll agree. Does anybody have a question for Anil? Yes. I'm going to ask you to shout if you can, rather than run around with the microphone. How that goes.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me.
And throw your mic.
Yeah, I wanted to ask two questions. So, I don't know if you've done it already, but how are you planning on combining kind of the knowledge map you have of these papers with like the Earth observation kind of models? And secondly, like the body of scientific knowledge like changes over time, and so how are you handling changing?
Two great questions. Okay. I'll answer the second one first.
Please would you repeat the question? I think people at the back didn't hear that.
Absolutely.
So next time we will use the microphone.
So the second question was, how do we keep the body of scientific literature updated? And there are indeed, we don't know at the moment, because we have reason to believe that a very significant proportion of the new papers we're downloading are in fact LLM contaminated. In some extent, over half the papers in some journals are, perhaps even 100%. And so we don't trust anything new coming in, so that problem is not a problem in the immediate term, but it's a giant problem overall. The second one is, how do we combine them? So there are a staggering number of mechanisms by which you can combine these things together. One thing we're investing in is something called the Mattingly models. We're building differentiable computational models of our world's ecology. So this is something developed before machine learning became a thing by Drew Perbs and co. and Microsoft Research 10 years ago. And we suddenly realized that these actual computation models could fill in the gaps. And there's something called neural process modeling, where you can take in diverse data sources, so observational data, causal data, and then you can do meta learning across all of these different things in order to solve end-to-end problems. So my colleague Richard Turner just had a paper on weather prediction called Aardvark in Nature last week, where they sped up weather prediction from the state of the art by 10 times by using this technique across diverse data sources to do end-to-end learning. So that's the hottest game in town right now to have a go. But with these machine learning things, I have no idea if they'll work or not until you have a go. So I'm not, I wouldn't, I would encourage a diversity of experiments using these. Getting the data was the hardest bit in the first place.
Okay, time for one more, I think, and then after that, I'm going to ask the next speaker, wherever you are, to come on down and start getting ready. I think David had his hand up first.
Well, David, I'm sorry, I missed your tutorial.
No, quite all right. I very much enjoyed your talk. I thought it was very interesting, so thank you. I was particularly interested in the points you were making around ensuring that we are building AI systems that have continuity, are robust, I think was one of the words you used, a word I typically use in a similar context is models that you can trust. I think there's a lot of challenges in that space, as you clearly identified. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on things that we as a community or other organizations could be doing to try and solve some of those problems, and what steps should we be doing to make steps in that direction?
It's a great question. I think I've been in emergency mode for the last 3 months because my group has been downloading lots of data from the US that is being deleted right now. And so I just mirrored half of the US fisheries forest data, for example. Whole institutions being turned off. So irrespective of any one political action, though, it is obvious that if we are gathering centuries of biodiversity data, we cannot depend on any one organization or country anywhere in the world to store these things. So we have to go back to what libraries used to be, which is stores of knowledge that replicate data and allow for the cross-referencing and sharing and bilateral kind of communication around that. So if you have a big, giant multilateral system, as we had after World War II with NATO and so on, then it's clear that it'll have a certain amount of brittleness. And particularly around climate data, there is a lot of political sensitivity, which is quite, geopolitically quite fair. So India and China do not like sharing precipitation data, for example, and so you have to do individual negotiations. And it's not uncommon for the UK to be a neutral ground for these kind of collaborations. I've sat with people whose countries do not have research sharing agreements who are willing to sit in neutral ground in a university here and know that they can actually have a reasonable conversation. So it is vital that institutions, like Exeter, just across the UK, actually step up, start putting computational resources towards this, building digital libraries, and making sure that we also replicate this knowledge in the global south as well. This is the perfect time to leapfrog. If USAID is shutting down, then we should build this capacity into Africa, into Indonesia, into India, into South America, and make sure that they have the data stores so they can control their own futures as well. So I believe very passionately in that, and I'm happy to work with anyone who's interested in building these kind of federated data stores.
Fantastic. A call to arms. All right. Thank you again, Anil. Wonderful talk.